Thaddeus Stevens was a member of the United States House of Representatives from Pennsylvania and one of the leaders of the radical Republican faction of the Republican Party during the 1860s. A fierce opponent of slavery and discrimination against African Americans, Stevens sought to secure their rights during Reconstruction, in opposition to President Andrew Johnson. As chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee during the American Civil War, he played a major part in the war's financing. Stevens was born in rural Vermont, in poverty, and with a club foot, giving him a limp he kept his entire life. He moved to Pennsylvania as a young man, and quickly became a successful lawyer in Gettysburg. He interested himself in municipal affairs, and then in politics. He was elected to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, where he became a strong advocate of free public education. Financial setbacks in 1842 caused him to move his home and practice to the larger city of Lancaster. There, he joined the Whig Party, and was elected to Congress in 1848. His activities as a lawyer and politician in opposition to slavery cost him votes, and he did not seek re-election in 1852. After a brief flirtation with the Know-Nothing Party, Stevens joined the newly formed Republican Party, and was elected to Congress again in 1858. There, with fellow radicals such as Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, he opposed the expansion of slavery and concessions to the South as war came. Stevens argued that slavery should not survive the war. He was frustrated by the slowness of President Abraham Lincoln to support his position. He guided the government's financial legislation through the House as Ways and Means chairman. As the war progressed towards a Northern victory, Stevens came to believe that not only should slavery be abolished, but that African Americans should be given a stake in the South's future through the confiscation of land from planters to be distributed to the freedmen. His plans went too far for the moderate Republicans, and were not enacted. After Lincoln's assassination in April 1865, Stevens came into conflict with the new president, Johnson, who sought rapid restoration of the seceded states without guarantees for freedmen. The difference in views caused an ongoing battle between Johnson and Congress, with Stevens leading the radical Republicans. After gains in the 1866 election, the Radicals took control of Reconstruction away from Johnson. Stevens's last great battle was to secure articles of impeachment in the House against Johnson, though the Senate did not convict the president. Historiographical views of Stevens have dramatically shifted over the years. From the early 20th century view of Stevens as reckless and motivated by hatred of the white South, to the perspective of the neo-abolitionists of the 1950s and afterwards, who applauded him for his egalitarian views. Early life and education. Stevens was born in Danville, Vermont, on April 4, 1792. He was the second of 4 children, all boys, and was named to honor the Polish general who served in the American Revolution, Thaddeus Kosciuszko. His parents were Baptists who had emigrated from Massachusetts around 1786. Thaddeus was born with a club foot, at the time seen as a judgment from God for secret parental sin, and his older brother was born with the condition in both feet. The boy's father, Joshua Stevens, was a farmer and cobbler who struggled to make a living in Vermont. After fathering 2 more sons, Joshua abandoned the children and his wife Sarah. The circumstances of his departure and his subsequent fate are uncertain. He may have died at the Battle of Oswego during the War of 1812. Sarah Stevens struggled to make a living from the farm, with the increasing aid of her sons. She was determined that her sons improve themselves, and in 1807 moved the family to the neighboring town of Peacham, where she enrolled young Thaddeus in the Caledonia Grammar School. He suffered much from the taunts of his classmates for his disability. Later accounts describe him there as willful, headstrong, with an overwhelming burning desire to secure an education. After graduation, he enrolled at Burlington College of the University of Vermont. but suspended his studies due to the federal government's appropriation of campus buildings during the War of 1812. Stevens then enrolled in the sophomore class at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. At Dartmouth, despite a stellar academic career, he was not elected to Phi Beta Kappa. This was reportedly a scarring experience for him. Stevens graduated from Dartmouth in 1814, and was chosen as a commencement speaker. Afterwards, he returned to Peacham and briefly taught there. Stevens also began to study law with Judge John Mattox in Danville. In early 1815, after writing to friends in York, Pennsylvania, he moved there. Pennsylvania attorney and politician. Early years in Pennsylvania, Stevens taught school at the York Academy and continued his studies for the bar. Local lawyers passed a resolution barring from membership anyone who had followed any other profession while preparing for admission, a restriction likely aimed at Stevens. Undaunted, he reportedly presented himself and 4 bottles of Madeira wine to the examining board in nearby Harford County, Maryland, and few questions were asked but much wine drunk. He left Bel Air the next morning with a certificate allowing him, through reciprocity, to practice law anywhere. Stevens then went on to Gettysburg, the seat of Adams County, where he opened an office in September 1816. Stevens knew no one in Gettysburg, and initially had little success as a lawyer. His breakthrough, in mid-1817, was a case in which a farmer who had been jailed for debt later killed one of the constables who had arrested him. His defense, although unsuccessful, impressed the local people, and he never lacked for business thereafter. In his legal career, he demonstrated the propensity for sarcasm that would later mark him as a politician. Once telling a judge who accused him of manifesting contempt, "Sir, I am doing my best to conceal it." Many who memorialized Stevens after his death in 1868 agreed on his talent as a lawyer. He was involved in the first 10 cases to reach the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania from Adams County after he began practice, and won 9. One case he later wished he had not won was Butler v. Delaplane, in which he successfully reclaimed a slave on behalf of her owner. In Gettysburg, Stevens also began his involvement in politics, serving 6 one-year terms on the borough council between 1822 and 1831 and becoming its president. He took the profits from his practice and invested them in Gettysburg real estate, becoming the largest landowner in the community by 1825, and had an interest in several iron furnaces outside town. In addition to assets, he acquired enemies. After the death of a pregnant black woman in Gettysburg, there were anonymous letter writers to newspapers, hinting that Stevens was culpable. The rumors dogged him for years. When one newspaper opposed to Stevens printed a letter in 1831 naming him as the killer, he successfully sued for libel. Anti-Masonry. Stevens's first political cause was anti-Masonry, which became widespread in 1826 after the disappearance and death of William Morgan, a Mason in upstate New York. Fellow Masons were presumed to be the killers of Morgan because they disapproved of his publishing a book revealing the order's secret rites. Since the leading candidate in opposition to President John Quincy Adams was General Andrew Jackson, a Mason who mocked opponents of the order, anti-Masonry became closely associated with opposition to Jackson, and to his policies once he was elected president in 1828. Jackson's adherents were from the old Democratic-Republican Party and eventually became known as the Democrats. Stevens had been told by fellow attorney James Buchanan that he could advance politically if he joined them, but Stevens could not support Jackson, out of principle. For Stevens, anti-Masonry became one means of opposing Jackson. He may also have had personal reasons, as the Masons barred cripples from joining. Stevens took to anti-Masonry with enthusiasm, and remained loyal to it after most Pennsylvanians had dropped the cause. His biographer, Hans Trefus, suggested that another reason for Stevens's virulence was an attack of disease in the late 1820s that cost him his hair, and the unwelcome illness may well have contributed to his unreasonable fanaticism concerning the Masons. By 1829, anti-Masonry had evolved into a political party that proved popular in rural central Pennsylvania. Stevens quickly became prominent in the movement, attending the party's first two national conventions in 1830 and 1831. At the latter, he pressed the candidacy of Supreme Court Justice John McLean as the party's presidential candidate, but in vain, as the nomination fell to former Attorney General William Worth. Jackson was easily re-elected. The crushing defeat caused the party to disappear in most places, though it remained powerful in Pennsylvania for several years. In September 1833, Stevens was elected to a one-year term in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives as an anti-Mason, and once in Harrisburg sought to have the body establish a committee to investigate Masonry. Stevens gained attention far beyond Pennsylvania for his oratory against Masonry, and also quickly became expert in legislative maneuvers. In 1835, a split among the Democrats put the anti-Masons in control of the legislature. Granted subpoena powers, Stevens summoned leading state politicians who were Masons, including Governor George Wolfe. The witnesses invoked their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and when Stevens verbally abused one of them, it created a backlash that caused his own party to end the investigation. The fracas cost Stevens re-election in 1836, and the issue of anti-Masonry died in Pennsylvania. Nevertheless, Stevens remained an opponent of the order for the rest of his life. Crusader for education. Beginning with his early years in Gettysburg, Stevens advanced the cause of universal education. At the time, no state outside New England had free public education for all. In Pennsylvania, there was free education in Philadelphia, but elsewhere in the state, those wishing to have their children educated without paying tuition had to swear a pauper's oath. Stevens opened his extensive private library to the public and gave up his presidency of the borough council, believing his service on the school board more important. In 1825, he was elected by the voters of Adams County as a trustee of Gettysburg Academy. As the school was failing, Stevens got county voters to agree to pay its debt, allowing it to be sold as a Lutheran seminary. It was granted the right to award college degrees in 1831 as Pennsylvania College, and in 1921 became Gettysburg College. Stevens gave the school land upon which a building could be raised and for many years served as a trustee. In April 1834, Stevens, working with Governor Wolfe, guided through the legislature an act to allow districts across the state to vote on whether to have public schools and the taxes to pay for them. Gettysburg's district voted in favor, and also elected Stevens as a school director, where he served until 1839. Tens of thousands of voters signed petitions urging a reversal. The result was a repeal bill that easily passed the Senate. It was widely believed the bill would also pass the House, and be enacted despite opposition by Stevens. When he rose to speak on April 11, 1835, he defended the new educational system, stating that it would actually save money, and demonstrated how. He stated opponents were seeking to separate the poor into a lower caste than themselves, and accused the rich of greed and failure to empathize with the poor. Stevens argued, "Build not your monuments of brass or marble, but make them of ever-living mind." The repeal bill was defeated. Stevens was given wide credit. Trefus suggested that the victory was not due to Stevens's eloquence, but due to his influence, combined with that of Governor Wolfe. Political change. Moved to Lancaster in 1838, Stevens ran again for the legislature. He hoped that if the remaining anti-Masons in the emerging Whig Party gained a majority, he could be elected to the United States Senate, whose members until 1913 were chosen by state legislatures. A campaign dirty even by the standards of the times followed. The result was a Democrat elected as governor, Whig control of the state Senate, and the state House in dispute, with a number of seats from Philadelphia in question. Though Stevens won his seat in Adams County, Stevens sought to have those Philadelphia Democrats excluded, which would create a Whig majority that could elect a speaker and himself as senator. Amid rioting in Harrisburg, later known as the Buckshot War, Stevens's ploy backfired, with the Democrats taking control of the House. Stevens remained in the legislature most years through 1842, but the episode cost him much of his political influence, as the Whigs blamed him for the debacle and were increasingly unwilling to give leadership to someone who had not yet joined their party. Nevertheless, he supported the pro-business and pro-development Whig stances. He campaigned for the Whig candidate in the 1840 presidential election, former General William Henry Harrison, though Stevens later alleged that Harrison had promised him a cabinet position if elected. He received none, and any influence ended when Harrison died after a month in office, to be succeeded by John Tyler, a Southerner hostile to Stevens's stances on slavery. Although Stevens was the most successful lawyer in Gettysburg, he had accrued debt due to his business interests, refusing to take advantage of the bankruptcy laws. He felt he needed to move to a larger municipality in order to gain the money to pay his obligations. In 1842, Stevens moved his home and practice to the city of Lancaster. He knew Lancaster County was an anti-Mason and Whig stronghold, which ensured that he retained a political base. Within a short period, he was earning more than any other Lancaster attorney. By 1848 he had reduced his debts to $30,000, and paid them off soon after. It was in Lancaster that he engaged the services of Lydia Hamilton Smith, a mulatto housekeeper who remained with him the rest of his life.